In 2017, Microsoft launched Game Pass, a decision that would fundamentally change the company's gaming strategy. Instead of focusing on selling individual games or consoles, they decided to go all in and try to gain more Game Pass subscribers. In order to make those subscribers, they fought governments around the world in order to purchase companies like Activision Blizzard and Bethesda for billions of dollars. However, did you know that before Game Pass, before EA Play, before PlayStation Now, there was another company that had the same vision of being the Netflix of video games? Enter Gametap. Launched in 2005 by Turner Broadcasting, Gametap was the original so-called Netflix for games. Much like Game Pass, Gametap offered a wide selection of fast titles ranging from retro arcade classics all the way to AAA contemporary titles at the time that you could access and download directly to your computer for a monthly subscription fee. And also like Game Pass, games could change on the monthly based on what licensing agreements they had with publishers and developers at the time. So games could fall off the service and new games could be introduced. So far, both of these services have sounded very similar to each other. However, there was a different philosophy when it came to Gametap. You see, they actually cared about game preservation, and because of that, a lot of the things they would push their users to play were older games. And the way they did that was by providing a means to play arcade classics through an emulator that was built into their desktop program. This contrast highlights a big difference in philosophies between Gametap and all the modern gaming subscription services that are out there. Gametap wanted to offer a way for people to play older game classics without putting in all the effort it would require to look into emulation, getting ROMs, and getting it set up. Especially back in the day, that was much harder than it is now. And Gametap made it easy for players. If in the mid-2000s you wanted to play an arcade classic, Gametap was a good place to go for that. So, what happened to Gametap? How did this ambitious service that was ahead of its time fade into obscurity? I'm going to try to answer that question today, but even so, more importantly, I want to go back in time and take a look at Gametap. Let's go. It's April 2005. The PlayStation 2 is the hottest console on the market. Revenge of the Sith is a month away, and it is the best Star Wars movie that anyone will ever see. They just don't know it yet. World of Warcraft is starting to become an online sensation. Steam was barely starting to offer third-party titles on it after a bunch of Half-Life 2 owners begrudgingly download the program, and the Xbox 360 is on the near horizon. Turner Broadcasting announced that it would create a service to offer classic and new video games called Gametap. The idea of Gametap came from an employee of Turner Broadcasting, a man named Blake Lewin. He brought this idea forward and they actually greenlit the project. Blake may not have known this at the time, but he set the groundwork for what would become gaming as a subscription model in the near future. Shortly after its 2005 announcement, Gametap launched a large marketing campaign to garner interest in the product. Being that Gametap was owned by Turner Broadcasting Systems, who in turn is owned by Warner Bros., they could leverage their large media empire to quickly get the word out about this new service that they were planning to launch that same year. The airways were filled with Gametap commercials. If you were around at that time, you probably saw one, or you saw an ad in a magazine, or maybe on your favorite website you like to hang out on. Turner Broadcasting even went on record to state that this was going to be doing for games as what Turner and Warner Bros. Did for television and cable at the time. On October 17th, 2005, Gametap launched with a library of about 300 games and with licensing agreements with big companies such as Activision, Electronic Arts, Sega, Namco, and among others. They were making these licensing agreements with these companies before Steam was able to make the licensing agreements to sell their games on Steam's platform. Having launched with a strong lineup of games, they already had plans to launch new games every month to keep the subscriber base happy and subscribed, but they also wanted to dip their toes in other avenues so that they could offer more to their subscribers and bring in other people who may still be on the fence. So they started Gametap TV shortly after in 2006. So the idea behind Gametap TV was very similar to what Machinima was for a long time. They were going to do things like gaming documentaries. They had like a music channel dedicated to gaming music. They had an animation channel. They had some gaming machinimas. They did have some Adult Swim shows on there as well, but it was mostly focused on gaming. It honestly seemed like the idea behind Gametap TV had everything to do with Turner Broadcasting rather than with the original founders. Now, I couldn't find definitive information on that, but most of what I saw from news websites and articles about Gametap TV seemed to indicate Warner Bros. Was really pushing for this. And of course they would. They're a television company first, so they wanted to also break out because G4 TV was popular at the time. I will say they did produce some pretty cool content for the Gametap TV for the little time that it ran. They produced a Tomb Raider animated series that was actually pretty interesting. They also produced some other unique stuff, but ultimately it didn't last very long. They also tried to do something called Gametap Read, which was basically a news portion of the website for gaming news, and it was run by a former IGN editor-in-chief, but that also didn't do very much for them because ultimately people were coming there to use the gaming subscription service to play games, not much else. Coming into 2007, Gametap was already starting to show cracks in its foundation. See, Gametap did attract a modest but dedicated subscriber base. While the exact numbers aren't there, it was reported that it didn't do as well as they were hoping, and with estimates ranging in a few hundred thousands. But the exact number was not widely publicized, and the service never reached the massive subscriber count that modern platforms like Game Pass would in the near future. However, because of this, they decided to try another model, which was having a free ad-supported version to see if it could basically attract more users and convince them to actually pay for the service. But that didn't last very long either, as it didn't really work out. 2007 was also a tough year for Gametap and its subscribers, as they started to lose games rapidly as 2-year licensing agreements started to fall off. And it was very clear that Warner didn't want to continue pumping money into it because in the following year they announced that they were looking to sell. So a lot of those games that were lost didn't really get regained afterwards. Going into 2008, they lost over 70 games, and a lot of them were their bigger titles. It also didn't help that they were just celebrating a milestone at that time of acquiring over 1,000 games for the platform, and then after this drop in licensing agreements with multiple companies, it dropped them below 1,000 games once again, becoming a rather short-lived victory from them. And even articles and people who were talking about it at the time were kind of poking fun at this entire situation. Now, something I haven't mentioned up until this point, but there was a positive during late 2006 to 2007 for Gametap, which was their exclusive game deals that they had going on. They did have some exclusives, such as Telltale's Sam & Max, which is still beloved to this day. They also had Myst Online, which they had launched in 2006, which was basically an MMO where players would solve puzzles together in an episodic format. And they also had American McGee's Grimm, but that game didn't have too much more than a mild reception. There is a small cult following for Grimm. I do see that it's still sold on GOG and people still enjoy playing it. The thing here though is Gametap wanted to make sure they release all these games in episodic format so they can keep people subscribed. So basically, if you wanted to see the next part instead of getting the full experience, you would have to stay subscribed to Gametap or come back the next month in order to play the next part of the game that you enjoyed. But as I stated before, going to 2008, later on that year, Warner Bros. Decided to go ahead and sell Gametap, and they sold it to a company called Metaboy. It was a French publishing game company. I can tell you as a Gametap subscriber at the time of the whole transition that this was the beginning of the end for Gametap. While yes, everything that happened at Turner before this does show that Gametap wasn't probably profitable at all for them, I will say that Gametap did have a dedicated subscriber base, albeit maybe a smaller to medium-sized one. I do believe in some sense that Gametap may have been able to survive if they were a bit more wise with how they spent their money instead of expanding to all these other programs, but I don't think that was their fault. I believe that was Warner's fault. I also believe that Gametap looked too much at quantity over quality too many times. They really like to sell you that you were getting so many games at a price that was affordable, but the thing is that at a point Gametap started to become filled with shovelware and other games that no one was really going to pay for to play no matter what. And there was only a few hidden gems from indie titles to other AA titles, and then the occasional AAA that was still there, such as Dawn of War and Hitman were still on there at that time. But I will say some of that is speculation on my part, just based on my previous experience with them and using the service, as well as the research I did to make this video. I do want to get back on track and focus on what was happening to them during 2009. So going back to what I was saying, selling to this company was the worst thing that can happen to Gametap, simply because the plugin that they were very popular for, this plugin that was what I would liken to the Steam Big Picture mode, very similar to that, was shut down in favor of a website built-in plugin for people to get their games verified so they could play them as a form of DRM. They also moved away from the original subscription models and went to a free-based one, which was just a handful of games, mostly like a preview of the service, a classic pack, which was mostly older games and arcade classics, and then if you wanted to play bigger AAA Windows games, you would pay for the gold membership. But this is the worst part about what affected them so badly when they moved over to this website plugin. So at this time, Windows 64-bit was becoming a thing, and it was becoming more popular and installed on more modern systems. Well, If you had a Windows 64-bit system, you can forget about playing half the games on Gametap. In fact, a lot of them would not work unless it was a 32-bit, and so they needed an entire section of the website specifically for 64-bit versions of the games. And if they didn't have it, if they didn't have a 64-bit version of that game on your system, you couldn't play it. It just wasn't happening. So you pay for a service where you can even play a lot of the games. Ultimately, I'll say that going into 2011, I lost full interest in Gametap and no longer renewed my subscription. It did eventually shut down in 2015, but it was essentially just a continuous repeat of the same cycle. They were losing more games, they weren't able to pay for better licensing for better games, they were starting to become wholly reliant on some of their older game offerings, and eventually it just wasn't profitable and it kind of just stuck around until it finally fizzled out. It wasn't with a bang, it just kind of fizzled out. It silently shut down in 2015, and that people had already forgotten it by then. Probably didn't even realize it was still active by that point. Ultimately, what I know about Gametap, from what I've done with it back in the past all the way to what I've researched, tells me one thing. Gametap had an initially strong investment that just wasn't kept up with, which is typical to see during this time when it came to gaming. A lot of companies, especially companies that weren't originally gaming companies, in this case Turner Broadcasting Systems, would start these projects because they saw how popular gaming was, and then they would just kind of give up on them once they realized they weren't in for it. They didn't want to go in for the long haul, and it wasn't the return on investment that they thought it was going to be. Because sometimes, especially when it comes to gaming, the investment and the return on investment can be a long time thing. And honestly, this is being reflected to this day. Game Pass is still not profitable. They are putting billions of dollars into it, and Microsoft is hoping that some point down the line it becomes profitable. Turner Broadcasting didn't even have the patience to give Gametap a couple years to cook. They didn't even want to try to get new, better license or renew anything. They were just done with it by year 2 because they just didn't feel like there was a return on investment. Another thing that's even echoing to this day was I saw this in old forum posts back in the day when I was doing research and I found these archive links, was that people were subscribing to Gametap to play very certain games, and then they were unsubscribing once they were either done with them or the games were removed from the service. Something you're seeing with Microsoft to this day with Game Pass. People are going to subscribe to Microsoft's Game Pass, play a AAA game that they put out instead of giving them $70, play the game, and then once they're done with it, they unsubscribe and wait for the next one. Why subscribe the entire time if you're not interested in the rest of the library? If I had to find a very simple reason as to why Gametap didn't survive, I would say that they were run by a company that didn't understand the rapidly changing gaming market as a whole, and to top it off, they were doing too much at once to really pay attention to the fact that they needed to offer unique content and something exclusive to people who were subscribing to Gametap in order to keep their attention. Otherwise, there really wasn't much of a reason to subscribe to them for one specific game. If I had to summarize the problem with Gametap, I would say it couldn't adapt to the rapidly changing digital gaming landscape market. It was a good idea at the time, but they couldn't offer AAA games on release. A lot of the things they were offering were games that were already a bit older by the time they hit Gametap. And a lot of the times those games were already cheap enough that if you were just wanting to play that game, it would be cheaper just to buy it and own the product through something like Steam or another digital storefront than going to Gametap and subscribing for that 1 month just to play that game. Furthermore, the content they did offer wasn't really what the subscribers were coming there for. While Gametap TV was interesting, I don't think it was necessary in any way. The best thing they could have done is put that money towards trying to acquire some either big game or better exclusives for Gametap in order to actually succeed. Kind of like what Epic does now, where they try to get exclusive games on their platform to get people to go play on it outside of Steam. And even that's not really working for them. A lot of people refuse to leave Steam. But during this time, Gametap could have been successful with that. But I want to leave on a positive note. The one good thing Gametap did was be creative in what they were acquiring. There is a lot of game series that I'm sure no one would have played if they hadn't had a Gametap subscription at the time that it showed up, and actually give it a chance and actually find something enjoyable from a game that you probably wouldn't have bought otherwise. Games such as Cleve Barker's Jericho, Titan Quest, Sacred 2, Necrovision, and of course it started my love of Warhammer with Dawn of War. When they added Dawn of War, Dark Crusade, I was all in. I became a huge Warhammer fan. At this point, Gametap is a legacy that has mostly been forgotten about, but I feel like it was a interesting time, and I really enjoyed it when it was at its peak. I also see a lot of the mistakes Gametap made being replicated by current modern day subscription models, especially when it comes to gaming. The main difference when it comes to Game Pass and Gametap is that Game Pass is trying to become what Xbox is. Game Pass is trying to start selling itself rather than selling Xbox to you. In the future, I'm sure for Xbox, basically what an Xbox will be is that you load up an app on your TV or you get like an Xbox Roku stick, and that's how you're going to play your Xbox. I'm pretty sure in the near future Xbox won't keep selling consoles. I believe they'll still make another one, but I think we're coming up on the last few Xboxes that Microsoft will ever make. I know they're all in on this Game Pass thing, but I don't know how it's going to work out for them or if that investment will ever pay off because they've put so much money into it. Only time will tell. But that has been my brief little history on Gametap. Hopefully you learned something interesting or at least enjoyed it. If you did like it, please like and subscribe and have a good rest of your day. Thanks for watching.